Thank you all for coming here for this panel, kind of more debating, discussing universal basic income and its political implications. We're going to do this somewhat, extemporaneously, partially, not because we're ill-prepared, even though I'm having a pretty bad week. I have a minor cold, just walked into a door. It happens. But because, there's dozens and dozens of pages in Jacobin, in Dissent, and other venues by all three of these editors and authors on this topic. So I feel like we've been having this debate, internally for years. So it should come out pretty naturally. So you all are encouraged to interrupt each other, yell at each other, and whatnot.
We'll be throwing chairs in the tent.
Yeah, but Alyssa Battistoni is a graduate student at Yale. She's also an editorial board member at Jacobin. Peter is also a Jacobin editorial board member. And he's the author of 4 features, Life After Capitalism, a really great book that just came out, and I see everywhere. I see people on the subway reading it. Good. I sometimes try to serendipitously take photos of them to send to Peter, but I'm like, this might be kind of just weird. And Seth Ackerman is also a editorial board member at Jacobin. He's written quite a bit on the topic. These are debates, I guess, mostly in 2012, 2013. So they're deep inside our archives. They will soon be, most of them are actually formatted and available. We just got a new site, so we're in the process of reformatting the old articles. But I think in anticipation for this event, I think I got to all of those articles, so you should take a look online. But I guess to start with, Peter, how'd you kind of come to this, your position on universal basic income, if you want to flesh it out, and how do you think it ties into, the rest of your work around, essentially this kind of post-work leftism, but one that you're connected, you're bringing into the democratic socialist tradition where this wasn't really foregrounded. We're kind of the Humphrey Hawkins full employment socialist left that, obviously it's a terrible bill. I was using that kind of as a joke. But that was I think the dominant thrust of this DSA-ish orientation.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny too because the whole debate about universal basic income and related demands has changed quite a bit since I first came across this stuff, which was 10 to 15 years ago probably, when it was much less sort of known as a concept, this idea of demanding a base level of income that everyone should just simply get as a check, irrespective of having a job or looking for a job or fulfilling any requirement, just as a sort of social wage or a social right of citizenship. And the appeal of it, the initial appeal of the basic income as a demand is its simplicity. First of all, that it is something that is simply everyone gets a check, and even rich people get a check, but of course in a system of progressive taxation, then that money would just get taxed back. So it's sort of an accounting fiction. But there's a political principle behind that idea of universality, and in some ways, it's just, for me, a generalization of what I think has always been the more emancipatory edge of the more traditional social democratic welfare state, which is what the sociologist Gustav Anderson called the decommodification of labor. So that what characterizes capitalism, and what for me characterizes one of the most objectionable and unfree aspects of capitalism, is people being forced to commodify their labor, that is, to sell their labor to a boss in order to earn a living. And to the extent that socialist and labor movements were able to win things like a universal right to health care or a universal right to education or a right to housing, that partially, as S.P. Anderson put it, partially decommodified their labor. Now you had a right to certain economic needs without having to sell your labor. And the basic income just becomes a sort of a generalized version of that, which, and we can get into this more, I think is important to say, is not necessarily to say it should replace all of these substantive rights. There are right-wing versions of the basic income that say you can get rid of the right to health care or the right to education and just give everyone checks. And there are reasons that we can get into why I think that that's very bad. But for something that is, the difference between getting a welfare check where you have to meet with a caseworker and you have to fulfill requirements and you have to jump through all these hoops versus a check that you just get as a matter of right, strikes me as something that's better as a way to treat people, and also reflects an important principle that I took from, sort of dissident social traditions going back to Paul Lafargue, who wrote The Right to be Lazy in the 19th century, to Andre Gors, who wrote about the sort of liberation from work, from the 60s on. This idea that a central objective of the socialist movement should be not glorifying work for the sake of work, but instead saying, what Marx and other Marxists said in the 19th century, which is we should take this vast productive potential of the society that we live in and use it to liberate us from work. And that the basic income, while not the magic bullet that automatically accomplishes that, does encode as a demand, I think, that principle of the liberation from work in the sense of wage labor that you do for others. I think I can probably stop at that point, and we can go off from there, because that to me was what was valuable in basic income, even back when nobody was talking about it, as just a way of encoding that thought.
But Marx also says, and Seth mentions this in one of his pieces, the Communist Manifesto. It says, obviously people have an equal liability of work, and the argument that Seth made, at least in this piece, is that if we're in an advanced industrial society where there's going to be a certain amount of alienated work that needs to be done, do we want to create, often, Peter doesn't do this, but often you'll talk to someone and say, why do you want a UBI? So people can leave the production process, and they put it like that. How will we fund it? Obviously in certain countries like Norway or others, they have sovereign wealth funds and whatnot, but a lot of times they're like, we'll fund it through higher taxation. So to some degree you are, funding a program to allow people to leave alienated work through the taxation of other people's alienated work.
Well, I think part of the reason also that I think the basic income debates are important is because I'm interested in problematizing and kind of challenging our conception of what work is, what it means. I like to say, I wrote this up, and one of the things I wrote for Jacobin is that we say work and we often mean three different things that we confuse. One of which is work is this kind of, what you're talking about, is the common liability to contribute to the reproduction of our material and our social life. Things have to get done, and people don't necessarily want to do them, and we have to sort of allocate those tasks. That's one conception of it. But then there's also just the conception of whatever you do that gets you a paycheck is work, whether it's socially necessary or not, or even destructive. You could be, working in some, incredibly, you working as a debt collector or working at Goldman Sachs. That's work in the sense that people get paid for it, but it's not what I consider, the work that we want people to be performing. And then the third sense of it is that people want fulfilling things to do with their lives. People want some sense of meaning and purpose. Yeah. And that can be connected to the other two senses of work, or it cannot be. And I think it's important as a political principle to start picking those things apart.
But so Seth, this is an argument where I think some people like me have said, okay, they're all good, but a jobs guarantee is more politically palatable, so I prefer that over basic income. But you actually have made and make the argument that in fact there is a pernicious effect of unemployment on people. Can you kind of explain your?
Well, I think that there's this issue.
It's not just a social stigma, in order just a kind of a surface level thing, but it's harder.
Yeah, I think, and it was partly encapsulated, I think, by that line in the manifesto, which I think was an attempt by Marx and Engels to partly just recapitulate a really common principle that was being enunciated by the socialist movements of the time already, and they were just kind of trying to crystallize it in their text, which was that the burden of contributing to the social production that has to be carried out in order for everyone to live and survive has to be distributed in some way that meets some criteria of justice, not just the fruits of that production, but also the burden of having to contribute to it. And that's why they said equal liability of all to work. And of course, at the time, the image of the the enemy, the parasite landowning and capitalist classes, was an image of a very leisured class of people who didn't work, and that was part of their identity. Today it's a little bit different. The rich have kind of changed their image and their social ethos, but I think the principle is the same, which is that we care about the fairness of and the justice, the criterion of justice for the distribution of the produce of all of our work. But we also, I think, care about the fairness of the distribution of the burden of contributing to that production. So yeah, that's what I was trying to get at.
But you also said that there might be some form of a universal basic income that could have a positive effect if it's maybe, let's say, $5,000 a year in an advanced capitalist country is not enough that someone can leave the production process, but might tighten labor markets enough that really low paying or bad jobs, maybe it might hasten up some of the automation of those jobs, or might allow those workers more ability to go on strike for like a month and things like that. Do you still think that? Or?
Yeah, I wrote that in the piece. I had a line saying that. I'm not sure I'm quite as optimistic now as I was then about that. Part of the issue here is a distinction between two different forms of income security, like programs. UBI is, among other things, I mean, Peter talked about how there are a lot of different reasons why various people have supported a basic income. One of the reasons, of course, is just income security, or an anti-poverty policy. It makes sure that nobody falls below a certain line of income. But UBI is a very specific form of a program like that, in that it is, as it's often called, an unconditional and universal benefit, which means that it's not just a benefit that goes to people who otherwise would be below that minimum threshold of income, but it goes to everyone. Everyone gets this check, and that then raises a whole host of pragmatic issues about how it's financed and the political ramifications of that make me often question whether the same purpose couldn't be better. Not perfectly, but better served by more traditional kinds of anti-poverty or income security programs, including just minimum income programs, which is different. And often UBI is confused with minimum income for a lot of people. But a minimum income program just says that if you fall below a certain line of income, then the government will make sure that you are brought back up to that level. Whereas a UBI gives automatically everyone a check for the same amount, and then taxes back in unequal or unproportional amounts so that it's progressively financed, so that it's redistributed.
Can you flesh out the difference between that and, let's say, other forms of means testing? Like, in other words, yeah.
Well, it is essentially a form of means testing. I mean, in the sense that it ensures that only those who would otherwise fall below a certain income threshold would receive the check. And I have to say that, I should probably explain this, because means testing is something that in almost every sphere of social policy or the welfare state, is something I think is extremely destructive. And so here I'm saying that means testing might be a better version of this particular program rather than the universal version, which is UBI. So I should explain why I say that. I think there's a fundamental difference between the kinds of programs that Esping Anderson and traditional social democratic programs and parties and intellectuals have advocated in the past and the present, which generally are universal programs that provide actual services. So there's universal healthcare programs. There are universal housing programs. There are various kinds of housing programs that make sure that everyone has housing, often actually provisioned by the state directly. Education, of course, we have a universal right to a public education at some level in most countries, and those are systems in which the principle here, the sort of traditional social democratic principle, was that everyone is entitled to the same, hopefully high quality benefit, provided in kind, a certain bundle of healthcare services, a certain bundle of housing services, a certain bundle of education services. And then to finance it, everyone contributes according to their ability to pay. And that's the basis of progressive taxation. So everyone receives the same benefit, but they contribute in amounts that are unequal in absolute amounts, because Bill Gates will pay a larger number of dollars than someone who makes a normal salary. but as a proportion of their income, it's progressive, so that the burden of financing falls most heavily on those who can most afford it. And UBI, in principle, is the same kind of system. Everyone gets the same benefit, same amount, and everyone contributes to it according to their ability to pay. But to me, there's a really basic difference here, because when it comes to UBI, the thing that's being provided is money, and the way that it's being financed is through money. So anyone can literally just sit down and, I mean, most people will not do that, and that's not really necessary for the point I'm making, can sit down and calculate that as Peter said, it's an accounting trick. And I don't think it's going to fool many people. And it's not even something that I don't think the idea is that you want to fool people, but if you compare that with the situation that you have, let's say, with a universal health care program. So in Britain, for example, the NHS, the National Health Service, despite all of its problems, is a beloved institution that politicians on the third rail of British politics, even Tory politicians who would love to get rid of the NHS, can't admit it in public most of the time. And yet, and in the case of the NHS, everyone receives the same right to the benefits of the NHS, and everyone pays, I think, in principle, in proportion to their income. So the rich are paying a lot more than the middle class and the poor in Britain for getting the same benefit. And I think that there's an incommensurability. You're paying a certain amount of money, you're receiving a certain set of benefits, you get to go to the doctor, if you're sick you can go to the hospital, you get these tests, you can get prescriptions and so on. And there really is no way to quantify or it's extremely difficult and opaque. Who's the winner, who's the loser? I think, and that's not how it's perceived by most Britons. Maybe the very rich, are very aware in Britain that they would probably be better off. Although even then, sometimes it's not the case. If you remember, Jimmy Kimmel gave that little discourse on his show about how even he, who was rich, had a problem when his kid had a heart problem, and there was a real question of financing. And if he didn't have insurance, he would have been screwed. So except for maybe a tiny number of very rich people, most people in Britain, I think, and this is the case with universal provision in kind, I think, in general, people don't think about it in terms of what do I give and what do I get. Instead, they think in terms of we are all entitled to these benefits. We all go to the NHS hospitals. We all go to the NHS doctors, especially when you don't have gradual privatization. Unfortunately, which is going on, but that's the principle. That's the sort of image of an understanding of a national health service. UBI, I don't think it really works like that. Everyone gets the same check, and meanwhile, at the end of on April 15th, everyone has to pay their taxes, and at that point, I think that the way that it ultimately ends up being conceptualized in people's minds is just basically what it is, which is a massive program of transfers from the richer to the poor, which is something that we're for, but it doesn't have it sort of loses the universal character or the benefits of the universal character of a social program because what's unique about it is you pay in money and you receive in money.
Well, within the working class, you're saying. So within wage members of the working class, people temporarily unemployed, whatever, it might spur resentments.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that it spurs. The fear that I have is that it will further entrench exactly the kind of social, one of the sort of political pathologies of a capitalist society, which is that you have this constant creation of divisions within the working class, often around work, where those who, for whatever reason, are in work resent those who are out of work, and this, in some ways, kind of, I fear, institutionalizes it in a way that's unhealthy. So
I want to get back to that issue and get a rebuttal from Peter. But before that, Alyssa recently wrote a piece in the spring issue of Dissent. Very good piece. The title is "The False Promise: Universal Basic Income," but it's a much longer piece that I won't accuse my colleagues at Dissent of writing. I mean, I'd say they're learning from Jacobin. That clickbaity kind of false title. I'm glad to see we're having an influence, but it's a really good piece, and I guess. Part of it charts the evolution of the idea of UBI from just, a fantasy just in a handful of people, maybe 5 years ago, to now being kind of, a genuine part of the political discourse. So, 5 years ago, it might have been that we would acknowledge, of course, like a version of this was also flattered by like Nixon, but like the right kind of like gave up on this in the 70s probably because they figured out that it was like actually a Trojan horse for left-wing politics and whatnot. But now there seems to be a bit of a comeback with certain members of, like someone like Andy Stern, who may not be the right, but he's at least the center right, and also just a lot of people in Silicon Valley, taking up the idea. So I guess I'm curious about whether your thinking on UBI has evolved as in relationship to those kind of shifts, whether we should maybe not worry about the fact that various shades of political opinion have, different versions of UBI, and stay resolute in pushing our version of it, or what? But particularly, I think Stern's evolution, which we should talk about in your article, is a really interesting one.
Yeah. So I mean, UBI has always been one of the things where there's like the left version and the right version, and that's been often one of the things that some people seem to think is one of its, the appeal of it, or one of its features, which is that it's there's some potential for like cross-ideological, bipartisan, some kind of political force, but I think that's one of the reasons that it's very dangerous and worrisome, or, Bhaskar mentioned the potential for it to be a potential like left-wing Trojan horse, but of course it can be a right-wing Trojan horse too, especially for like dismantling the remains of the welfare state to pay for it. And so that's always been like the thing that I think people who are interested in UBI are concerned about, and as it has gained a lot of popularity in the past years. I mean, I think there's both been a lot more discussion of it publicly, but also a number of programs, mostly in Europe, to do experimental trial runs of UBI. And in the U.S., it's mostly been sort of driven by like techno-capitalists in Silicon Valley. There's a lot of interest. I don't know if folks saw, like last week, I think Mark Zuckerberg said something about basic income. And there's been a lot of other sort of, Peter Thiel is a fan, Sam Altman, who's one of the founders of Y Combinator, a startup and startup accelerator in the Bay Area, and who's funding a sort of trial run in Oakland, I think this year. And so I think that's been, for me, cause for alarm, and sort of, as I think in part because basic income is so, there are a lot of different ways to design it or to implement it, and that is one of the things that means I think it's like a little more, what it looks like depends a lot more on the political forces that are pushing it through than with some other programs that might have a clearer like ideological kind of thrust to them. And so it seems like it's certainly been a moment that I've been reassessing, or not reassessing UBI itself. I think I share really Peter's sort of view of it as a powerful, idea for both rethinking the place of work in our lives and rethinking what work is, and particularly sort of drawing on like socialist feminists who have argued for kinds of work that have not often been valued in market activity and things like that. And so I think I've been very I like UBI in principle, but I've been increasingly nervous about it in practice. And so I guess it's been interesting seeing there's been, or one of the things I was wondering is sort of why are these why are all these sort of tech bosses so into basic income? Because as Seth was saying, it might you could just see it as like if you're rich, it's just a transfer of wealth to that's very visible to people who are you can count up that you're paying more than you're getting from it. It's been talked about by people on the left as like a permanent strike fund. It does not seem like necessarily something that you would be sympathetic to if you were, a sort of techno-capitalist. But, it seems like there are a few things going on there. One is I think one is sort of like some kind of well-meaning naivete and a kind of noblesse oblige kind of way where like, so Sam Altman is like, 50 years from now, I think it'll seem ridiculous. We used fear of not being able to eat as a way to motivate people which is sort of, as Peter pointed out, like the sort of like need to like sell your labor for a wage is one of the defining features of capitalism. So it's sort of this like, oh, wouldn't it be like people should just do what they're interested in or what they find really exciting, and that they can like unleash their inner entrepreneur or their inner innovator or whatever as soon as they have like their basic income. And then I think there's also this like view of it as kind of a backstop for the gig economy. So you can't really make a living wage driving for Uber or whatever, but if you have a basic income, then you can kind of just supplement that by driving on the side. It's kind of this acknowledgement that they can't actually afford to pay a living wage and do this sort of develop these kinds of sort of like faux employment things, or where they're like, oh, we're not employers, whatever. And I think this is often, I know it seems to me like a sort of acknowledgement that they can't pay the costs of a living wage and sort of transferring that responsibility to the public away from their the private employer. And then I think there's just like an element of it that's sort of like, oh, if we're into robots, and if robots take all the jobs, then shit, what are we going to do about all these people? Are they going to come for us? And so that's the kind of avoid the guillotine approach. So that's been like, kind of the dimension that a lot of, or like those are like the most high profile people, I think, although there's obviously also a robust debate on the left. And I think Peter's writing has been really crucial to that. And folks like Kathy Weeks. The person, as Bhaskar's mentioning, Andy Stern, the former head of SEIU, has recently wrote this book on basic income called Raising the Floor. And it's, this sort of book that's about how basic income will like solve all our problems, and is really great. And I found it a very frustrating book. He has this view of basic income that is, he really has this kind of like, he gets really enamored of Silicon Valley and tech stuff, and is like really like excited about reading like TechCrunch and like Singularity Hub and all this stuff. And is, at one point he's like, oh, there's more people playing this online game Myths of Pandaria to it took it like than it had, the labor movement had built in like years or something. So it's this very sort of strange position he's in, but so he's really worried about the jobless future, and he's sort of like, what are we going to do? And he sort of comes to this conclusion: we'll have a basic income, and it's partly out of this kind of, it'll prop up kind of flesh out the wages of people who are doing TaskRabbit or whatever. But his basic income is funded by, or his version is sort of one that you would fund by cutting certain welfare provision services. He's not like totally dismantled the welfare state, but a lot of it would come out of things that, many means-tested programs, and things like food stamps that are doing the kind of poverty assistance provision or poverty prevention that that's also describing. And I think it's very, and he's very like, oh, we can't do a soak the rich tax because then the rich won't be on board. Which I think is sort of Seth's point, right? It's like that, like if it's like a soak the rich, they'll get what's going on. They'll be like, why would I pay so much more so that I can pay a bunch of other people to not work? So it's that's this proposal, but he thinks that's fine. We should still do it, and I really do think it's very concerning that this is a proposal put forth by a former labor leader. Even Andy Stern has come in for a lot of criticism from the left of the labor movement. For being, I think, kind of very overly comfortable with like the industries and sort of CEOs and corporations that he is trying to unionize. But it's really, he basically says that UBI, not basically, he explicitly says that basic income is a solution to the problem of declining labor power. He's like, we need to look beyond unions for answers, and said, let's have a basic income party that will just run candidates and threaten a tax strike unless Congress agrees to vote on a basic income package, which is like just I think a non-starter, but also like a very not a good not a good way forward for the left. And so it's concerning to me that this is sort of the even somebody who's, you know, probably the most prominent, like, labor, I mean, you can understand why like, labor would not be the number one, like, constituency out there for a basic income, saying, like, you know, we don't need jobs. But even though, you know, I think there are good arguments that it could be helpful for people trying to organize, to have, like, a strike fund, to have the option of, like, going off work, to not be as sort of, you know, dependent on their job, as is typically the case, and I think that's one of the compelling cases for it, for you know, folks in the labor movement. But you know, still, this is his vision. It's not very compelling, and I think it is like a mark of where the sort of limits of you know, what the prospects for given the sort of state of the left now, which you know, is growing, and I think really building energy, but I'm concerned about like where basic income would go, given the kind of more general environment. And, yeah.
When Andy Stern is comparing the labor movement to like massively multiplayer games, it makes me like more in like Hoffa, you know, like that.
Maybe we just need like a massive online game.
But one thing that has been brought up is the issue of the feminist demands around basic income, but isn't it just the demands around basic income, not necessarily universal basic income? Because the arguments that, you know, this care work disproportionately done by women is unpaid, but it is work, so we're going to pay it as work, not, you know?
I mean, well, you know, Alyssa mentioned Kathy Weeks, and who I also draw from in my own thinking about this, who I think in the hands of like a feminist thinker like her, it's less. It's more a matter of raising the point that there is much of, again, I was talking about the three senses of work, and that there's much of what we consider work in the sense of some of the most socially necessary labor that is not compensated, and that that includes especially the work that women do in, you know, raising children and emotional labor and all that. But there's a broader sense of, rather than like that part of the point of this demand is precisely to call into question the idea that the things that people get paid for are meaningful, and the things that they don't get paid for are not meaningful, you know, as social activities.
But you could in fact pay for elder care and child care through a basic income, not a universal basic income.
I mean, I mean, as soon as you start talking about sort of tying it to some specific kind of activity, then you're back into the sort of means-tested world.
Right.
Kind of, you know, and that's the whole idea of the basic income demand, is to get away from that.
Government oversight, potential like racial and other disparities.
Well, I mean, so let me get into this, like, 'cause some of the stuff like that Seth brought up, right? That I do think it's very important. I mean, one of the shifts in my thinking about this over the years is that, like, when I first started talking and like thinking and writing about basic income, it was this sort of like obscure thing that was like, hey, this is an interesting thing to think with and a good thing to mix into our demands to help call into question some of these assumptions about work and what we want work to look like. Now I'm much more, I have also sort of shifted thinking about, hey guys, let's just like calm down a little bit. This is like, I still like it as a part of our mix of demands, but let's not get into this weird magic bullet thinking about it. And it's very important, like the stuff Seth is bringing up about the mix of different kinds of provision, right? And like I've written about why like you can't treat healthcare the way you treat other kinds of consumption, because our needs for it are fundamentally different, and we have substantive needs for the healthcare we need, not for just a equal check, right? Giving everyone an equal size check to buy healthcare is actually fundamentally inegalitarian. And that's the danger of the kind of right-wing basic income that Alyssa's talking about, is that that's what some of these Silicon Valley types want to do. And in that case, it becomes a different kind of accounting fiction in which you have to buy, there's no universal health care, so you have to buy your Obamacare. There's no good public transportation, so you have to pay for your Uber. And so then that's how it all gets sucked back in this like rentier logic of you get your basic income, but then it all gets sucked back into the hands of plutocrats. So it becomes a way of keeping sort of a kind of rentier capitalism going. And I think that that's quite dangerous, and I think it's why we should be talking about basic income not as sort of the replacement for the welfare state, but as the cash residual after the fundamental substantive rights that we think are important, like healthcare and education and housing, are dealt with. Because just to like, in response to like sort of Seth's political argument that it would be not a politically viable regime, I guess if we think that there is some kind of like monetary residual that people should be guaranteed, the question is like, not is basic income in the abstract going to be politically popular? Would it be more politically popular than like the kind of welfare regime that we used to have, which we know for a fact produced exactly the kind of invidious kind of right producerist divisions, you know, that Seth was warning about basic income. And so it's that distinction between universal versus means-tested cash benefits rather than basic income as a replacement for the whole system is what I'm more interested in. And then just the other final thing I'll say about that is that the other thing we should be talking about, since I pitched basic income as basically a post-work or anti-wage labor demand, is that we should be talking about the left's more traditional anti-work demand, which is shorter hours. Because that also helps to mitigate this problem of creating like sort of two classes of the people in wage labor and the people outside of it. And so these days, whenever I talk about basic income, I try to always say like we should be talking also about people being able to work less hours for the same pay.
So Alyssa mentions in her dissent piece, and this was mentioned, I guess, since the very first issue of Jacobin, Chris Maisano, the political aspects of full employment. This, classic, essay that, lays out the way in which, full employment actually creates, a tight labor market and creates a condition where workers, feel comfortable telling their boss to F off, they're going to get another job, whatnot, and actually encourages and spurs labor militancy. That wouldn't happen if labor markets weren't as tight. So I guess I bring up that because I guess the question is, like, is this sustainable within capitalism? Do any of us think that UBI or even a jobs guarantee, I know that's a separate question, are they sustainable within capitalism? Or are we all conceiving it as a transitional demand in a way? A demand that will ultimately loosen certain contradictions and pave the way for us to transition to a socialist economy? Or, I don't know.
Yeah, to me, the entire project of decommodifying labor is a transitional demand that is not ultimately sustainable within capitalism.
I definitely think that the idea of, I definitely agree with the Koletsky's idea of the political aspects of full employment, that full employment at a certain high level, a tight enough labor market, is not politically sustainable under capitalism, and it has this transitional dimension to it. And that, for me, is one of the main reasons why I think that a traditional kind of full employment conception is better than UBI or even any other kinds of welfare state provision as a transitional program, in the sense that a tight labor market creates this pressure. The reason why a very tight labor market, full employment, is so difficult to sustain under capitalism is precisely because it tends to generate the kinds of oppositional forces within capitalism that become a threat to it one way or another, either economically in terms of inflation or an erosion of profits, or they generally go together politically, because it tends to encourage, it gives an enormous amount of confidence and bargaining power to workers to be able to make demands, to be able to politicize their workplace, and to become more militant. And that's something certainly capitalists and their intellectuals have always been aware of. So whereas full employment has the potential, often does, generate some of the counterforces to capitalism, political counterforces to capitalism, that can move in the direction of it being a transitional program. UBI, to me, that's the sort of hollow center of it, is that, UBI, even if in theory, everyone got a large check, and work at that point for an individual was completely optional because you could live fine just on your check. It's just the relationship there is just everyone sits at home and receives a check from the government, and the political counterforce to capitalism, I don't see where that comes from. I've heard of the idea that Alyssa mentioned the idea that UBI, some people say it could be a permanent strike fund, and that's where I don't quite understand the logic here, because when we already have our kind of pitiful means-tested welfare state, one of the first things that anti-labor forces in every state legislature try to do is pass laws that deny food stamps and other kinds of anti-poverty benefits to people on strike. That's one of the oldest things that they've always done, and if we had a UBI and there was like a strike wave, I mean, it seems to me like the very first thing that they would do is try to deny UBI to people who are striking. And of course, at that point, a UBI advocate could say, well, then it would no longer be a UBI. But, well, too bad, it's not a UBI anymore. The question is, where is the political counterforce that can prevent that from happening? And whereas in the workplace you can generate those kinds of social solidarities and bonds, everyone sitting at home getting a check, I don't see how that works.
But Alyssa, you also view, like, even if in its best variant, if we push it through, you view it as a transitional demand, similar to what full employment or whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be the reason to push for it on the left. I mean, both to sort of do the, I think there are some sort of elements of it that are about, kind of trying to I guess, as a transitional demand, but also as a transitional demand towards what sort of, that is unsustainable for capitalism, but also for like what is our, what are we transitioning to? And if we have some, kind of view of working less and things like that, I think it can be a like horizon for that. I guess I'm not sure. So, so people like this Belgian philosopher Philippe Frase, who's written a bit about basically calls it the like capitalist verge of communism. And I do think the sort of some of the more recent like the sort of Silicon Valley versions or whatever, or like there are versions that are more like kind of the capitalist verge of saving capitalism from itself. And I do think that a lot of that depends on who's building the road. And I think you could just the sort of arguments that Seth's making about like full employment versus basic income. I mean the whole point of the clicky piece is that the obstacles are political to achieving full employment because bosses don't want it. So like that's the same thing that like if people are like, oh well we'll like alter UBI so that it's not a viable source of like a strike fund. I mean that would be the case for anything that would provide people with the kind of like option to opt out of out of their job or go on strike or whatever. Like I think that is the political aspect of it, and that's where you're constantly seeing different maneuvers to make whatever. I don't think that full employment is immune from that problem of sort of like how it would be, kind of our version would be tweaked to make it, not have the full force that it is intended to. But yeah, so I mean, I think basic income and like the left vision that we have for it should be a transitional thing. As I think Peter's written about, or and Kathy Weeks have written about, like Undercourse's idea of a non-reformist reform, where it's the kind of a reform that puts you on a path to that's not sort of limited to itself, and it puts you in a position to move beyond the sort of reformist position, and that I think is the ideal. Obviously, like the political challenge of getting the one we want is difficult, and I have things to say about that.
But I guess. Yeah,
I was just gonna throw in like adding on to that. To me, the thing that I run up against is that like while they're quite valid, the objections that Seth is making to basic income, a lot of them are applying in even stronger form to any other kind of cash provision. So unless you're saying that social democratic demands should be exclusively made up of direct substantive service provision, then it's like not clear to me how the argument works.
But so I guess, let's say if we're going to adopt the position, I know Seth disagrees with this, but let's just say for the sake of argument, we're adopt the position that UBI and jobs, kind of guarantee are both desirable. It's still a matter of kind of political priority, which one you push to, but doesn't that also tie into the question of agency? If you think that the primary mode that we're going to get to not only build a welfare state but go beyond it into socialist society is through working class agency, largely at the point of production, that would lend itself to a jobs guarantee. Whereas if you foreground questions of automation, the kind of shifting, sizes of workplaces potentially changing, workers needing to organize more at like the city central level or whatnot, then maybe that leads you in more of a UBI direction. Do you think, is that unfair? Or?
I mean, the problem I have is like when people start getting into we should just have like a jobs guarantee or something, is that it's basically going the opposite direction from where I want to go, is like calling into question this idea of what are jobs for, what is work for, and instead saying we're just going to commit ourselves in perpetuity to making up jobs for people, which I don't think is especially like. And people try to get out of this problem by saying, oh, but there's all this stuff that needs to be done, and we need to reconstruct our energy infrastructure and all this, which is true. But like, I think we should keep that question separate from the question of, is it just a good idea that everyone has to have a job doing something? Because I don't see how like having a make-work job is actually something that leads to more militant struggle than a basic income.
But the immediate reductions we have seen in the working day, the demands in places like France, the demands coming in Scandinavia and whatnot, haven't been in places where there's been a UBI administered. Obviously, it's been just the traditional welfare state has also led to those demands, just because the position of labor is strengthened. It's a almost natural demand of labor when it's in a stronger position to have more leisure time, right?
Yeah, I mean, and in some ways, right. At this point, I feel like maybe it's time, instead of having panels about debating the basic income, we should be talking more broadly about what is the social democratic program. I mean, Alyssa and I were just in a panel about eco-socialism, where we were discussing what is the ecological dimension of our demands, and then I would talk more broadly about how the welfare state can be struggled for in a way that leads in a post-work rather than sort of work perpetuating direction, rather than sort of focusing in too narrowly on basic income, which can lead in all the kind of right-wing deviations that Alyssa was warning about.
Yeah. So I think, Mike, do you know what time this ends? Oh, well. Does someone know what this ends?
20 past.
Okay, so maybe we should switch over to Q&A then. I don't know, this does touch on a lot of questions as relates to broader, what is a left social democratic or socialist strategy today is, because I think that if our emphasis on things like the changing nature of work and the impact of automation and whatnot does inform our positions, and so I agree that maybe we should start framing it more broadly, but also I think this is a good jumping off point to those questions. Yeah, go ahead. So we'll just take like 3 questions or so, then after that we'll turn it back to the panel.
So I'm wondering how you see UBI kind of playing into a concept of reparations, because I think when it comes to inequality, it doesn't solve that issue. And also, I'm just curious if there's ever been any talk or consideration for like an opt-in, opt-out UBI, where people would decide, I don't know how, but to opt in their income for this UBI kind of like.
Go ahead.
And if folks could speak up, because we're live streaming it, so that when people watching at home hear you.
Well, actually, it might even be better just to kind of when you're all responding, just maybe rehash the first little bit of their question.
You're talking about it at this point in quite abstract terms, and yet there are these experiments going on. So if we're considering it as a transition strategy, and the point is also to build collective power and these kind of things, has any research been done actually looking at its impact in some of the locals? Because at the moment you're talking on quite a big scale, but actually it's been implemented on quite a small scale. But has that made a difference in terms of worker power, in terms of strikes, in terms of inequality, in terms of new kind of experiments coming out, whether it be artistic or whatever, from freed up? So I was just wondering whether it's been kind of concretized in some ways, and whether any research has been done in that way.
So there's some people I do. Oh yeah, you go.
So, a couple of concepts here. One is we currently live under a market system. I see the UBI as addressing market demands. Cash, you spend it in the market. I think if we look at it from the point of view of labor, we want to get rid of the labor market. We want to have work, because work needs to be done. I have to go home and do my laundry, okay? Work must be done. Work is not bad. It's wage labor and the labor market, which we'd like to get rid of. So what can you have to say about, one, undermining the labor market, as well as how would you transition from a general market response, which is why the right and the left both like UBI, versus something that's non-market based?
Maybe we should respond to those. Those are very big questions.
Lots
So then,
lots to deal with here.
So, any order anyone want to jump in?
I can if you guys don't mind.
I'm happy to switch to. So to start, I guess on the the reparations question. So actually, the movement for Black Lives endorsed basic income as part of a reparations program. That's sort of in the model of there was also a basic income that was part of the Freedom Budget back in like the 60s. But so the reparations as for Black Lives, I believe, has like a sort of like UBI plus, where there's like a certain like a sort of reparations element to it, where everyone would have a basic income, but then some people would have like a you know, additional reparations like income to it. So that's one element, and I think actually is part of the, you know, kind of what it seems like if there were to be like an actual left political coalition, that seems like an important part of it to me. In terms of experimental programs, so there was a round of interest in the 70s, and there were a bunch of experiments done then, mostly small scale, like on like kind of like town level. And they all, you know, the results were like quite good in terms of people's like health and going up, and like, you know, spending more time on like education and things, and where people, when they had more time to, you know, kind of do what they wanted, like basically spend more time with like their friends and family and like in school and stuff like that. And so, you know, I guess you could sort of debate whether those things are good. They seem good to me. But like most sort of social indicators went up. The questions around, like, I think that, you know, the impact on labor is hard because it's never really been done at scale where you could actually see that kind of effect. The experiments basically going on in Europe right now are also like mostly at the city level, I believe. Like in Utrecht there's one, and then I'm not sure where exactly. There's one in Finland right now, and I'm not sure like what the scale of it is, but again, they're like they are experimental, so it's mostly like looking at these sort of social indicator types of things, and they're not like, will this let everyone go on strike? But the other thing that's sort of, I think, you know, the challenge there, but that's also illustrative, is that you know, none of the current schemes, like they're all, you know, they're providing enough to live on. It's not like a negligible amount, but it is pretty bare bones, and so it's like, and part of that is, I think, because they're coming out of sort of center-left pragmatism. And so, which is, you know, what the thrust of a lot of the debate in Europe has been. It's been this like kind of cross-ideological solution to like whatever sort of identified problems of the welfare state are, and so it's, you know, it is limited by political conditions there as well. But that, you know, that's not to. I think it's instructive in that, like, we would obviously be facing not a similar but worse set of like political conditions that would constrain like what was possible with the basic income here. And then, you know, on the sort of wage labor question, you know, again, as Peter was saying, there's obviously work to be done, and I don't think that's the, you know, the question. I think that I'm not sure. So in the sort of like, how do you get the work that needs to be done off the market? I mean, you know, basic income, yes, you get money to spend on the market, but you're not being paid a wage for the specific labor. So like, you know, it's not. I'm not sure. Like, would a jobs guarantee give you a job doing your laundry, right? Like, you know, the example you gave, like, I have laundry to go do at home. So like, I think there are a lot of things that are actually quite hard to, especially in coming out of some sort of socialist feminist analysis of social reproduction type stuff, that are harder to do with a jobs guarantee without just like parsing out every activity we do in our lives and say, that's a job now, like, here, I'll pay you for it. Which I don't think sounds particularly like either like getting away from wage labor, even if it's a wage paid by the state, or you know, desirable. So I think the question of, you know, like, are there still, like, basic income obviously, yes, uses money that you would spend on the market, but I don't think it's quite, I don't know if I quite think I agree with what you're saying there, so.
Yeah, so, yeah, just on the reparations thing, I mean, it's interesting because, like Alyssa was saying, there's been, it's acted like basic income has come into some of these more recent movement for Black Lives kind of demands. And this isn't directly about reparations, but it sort of is, given the way poverty is racialized in this country, that when, you know, back in the 60s and 70s, when welfare rights activists were sort of struggling against the limitations and the bureaucracies of like welfare as it existed, you had people like Francis Fox Piven, for example, who moved in the direction of a basic income as an alternative to, you know, to the welfare payments, and as a more sort of more radical and a more free demand. Of course, the thing really with reparations, I think, that to think about is, as you really know, the hugest gap is not income, it's wealth. And basic income, as it's normally proposed, is just an income transfer program and not a wealth transfer program, which is what needs to be really talked about if we're going to be really talking about addressing the historical legacy of racism in this country. To the opt-in question, I would just say, yeah, if it's opt-in, it's not universal. I mean, part of this, again, it's a transfer program. We're trying to claw back money from the rich, so everybody has to be liable. Yeah, on the experiments, it's interesting now how we are in this new wave where the experiments are all either in the sort of like European welfare states, or they're in like poor countries where it's like conceived as a new like aid strategy rather than this sort of conditional stuff. And yeah, I mean, it's like so many of those studies on it are just like talk about, these very social workers, people's health outcomes were better, and it didn't cause everyone to stop working, and it didn't cause them to all become drunks and watch TV all day or whatever, rather than is it opening up space for new ways of living and new kinds of activities or new politics. In terms of the politics of it, one of the experiments that I found very interesting was the one that was done in Namibia, where the experiment there was they provided a very small basic income that was like, I don't remember what it was, but it's like by, rich country standards, it was like almost nothing. But it still had very positive effects on the lives of the people who received it, but it also drove the white landowning class crazy. They immediately became convinced, despite there being no actual evidence of this, that it had turned, all of these Namibian peasants into drunks and lazy and, ruined everything. And so it's indicative of sort of like what Seth is talking about, of like the political backlash will come, and it will come fast. And so the sort of Philippe Van Paris idea of the capitalist road to communism, while I love it as a thought experiment, clearly leaves out the moment of political conflict that afflicts, I think, not just basic income, but all projects of building the welfare state, which is where Koletsky and all of that stuff comes in. And then to the final question, yeah, I regard basic income as part of a broader menu of things that are about opening up space in people's lives, both in terms of having resources and having time, which is why I pair it also with shorter hours. And so that can be how we start to build the non-market, non-wage labor spaces, the non-market activities, which could be an individual type of thing, like I just have time to do my laundry and I don't have to drop it off at the corner laundromat, or it could just be, or it could be more collective projects of building different kinds of cooperative workplaces and projects that can start to displace some of the alienated wage labor that people are engaged in now. And so that to me is what's interesting to me about it as a proposal. It's precisely that ability to at least start to open up those non-market spaces.
Well, I actually agree with on all three questions with what was said before.
It's a terrible debate.
I know, it's a terrible debate. I should probably come up with something that really annoyed me about them.
Let me. So, in this process of transition, right? I'm basically, I'm a 1909 German Social Democrat, so I have to, translate my politics to this. But like, at some point, if we're building a constituency to take state power to take over society, then there's a degree of like training that happens, right? And the radical conception of what socialist unions would do, what a socialist party would do, it would be to give workers the collective and organizational experience they would then use to actually run the production process and make decisions and expropriate capital. Is there a certain way in which a UBI could just be taking us away completely from where commodities are produced? So even if, let's say, we're in a future where commodities are produced with very little, human, inputs, but it's still obviously privately owned, is that a concern that we're not, we're not putting people in the position to actually, obviously they'll still live full lives, they'll still have time to if not hunt and fish, maybe we'll all be vegans by then, but but then at least, no, seriously, at least do other, things like read and write and think about different things, but are we just gonna, where do we, is that concern at all justified, that we're just ignoring or potentially could go down the route of ignoring those points where commodities are produced?
It is. I mean, certainly it is a question to what extent we will ever get beyond sort of like large-scale industrial production of a sort that has to be sort of like organized and run on a large scale, rather than sort of finding ways, both technical and social ways to live in, in a more decentralized way. Like that is an open question for the future. On the other hand, even if worst case scenario we end up like the fatzos in the spaceship in Wall-E, who just like watch TV and while robots pick up the trash, that's still, I would still take that.
That would have been a great Jacobin hot take like 4 years ago, 5 years ago. You completely missed the boat on that one. I guess we can take a couple more questions. Sorry, in the back.
So I'm guilty of working on one of these 15-year UBI experiments in Kenya. So just wanted to know if you had the opportunity to convince these kind of mainstream data-driven economists to add a qualitative component, what questions would you want to ask?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I just found apparently the first country to kind of apply basic income is actually Iran, and the way that they did it was pretty weird. It's pretty recent in 2011. They took out the subsidies they had for a lot of primary commodities like food and fuel, and they were like, all right, well, we'll give you a basic income instead. But apparently the basic income actually comes out to a significant portion of like a person's income, and as far as I can find, like it's again just like a bunch of economists being like, see, Iranians for this stuff working, isn't it great? And there isn't really a lot of data on like what the actual effect of it was on people, right? Like how much money did they lose from the subsidies being taken away, and how much money are they gaining here? And there also isn't a lot of information about labor there, obviously because labor is repressed a lot in Iran. And so I was wondering if you had any insights on that.
Yeah, one more. Yes, sorry, you can wait.
Yeah. First of all, I do think it's true that any UBI has to be above and beyond social welfare programs. But on the question of organizing on the shop floor, I'm thinking of the movie Blue Collar in 1979, and the great image of that on the auto factory. That's not happening in the auto factory. The automations itself undermining that whole process. And what I think UBI has a value for is precisely bringing into question the whole. Well, if all of this wealth is being produced with so much less labor that they can give me $2 grand a month, well, let's stop talking about how the wealth is produced and why it's all being appropriated by these 5 guys in Silicon Valley anyway. I mean, it raises questions that do go beyond, that go into real socialist issues in a way that even the most militant kind of labor organizing, which is fighting for higher wages and fighting for better working hours, doesn't. Right. Because the objective conditions have put those questions on the table.
So I'll turn it back to the panel now. I would say that there's still obviously 1,000 dock workers can still impact the lives of millions of people and whatnot. So I think there is. It might just be in different fields now, but even now, like in logistics with like Amazon plants and like warehouses and things like that, it still might be there. And also, I wonder whether we should bracket off the question of certain countries like Iran, Norway, which are getting these from like kind of have wealth funds, potential wealth funds for natural resources production. It's almost like, it seems to me, is it different?
I would say only in the sense that that the sort of baseline of where the sort of money is being taken from is this very specific thing. But yeah, like in a sense, Alaska has the only basic income in the United States, right? Because people get payments from the oil fund.
Any order for the questions?
Well, I mean, I think that sort of that even that kind of on the funding stuff, like the Alaska Permanent Fund that's from oil revenues. It is sort of this question of like ownership and who owns the means of productions or natural resources or whatever, and like who's sharing in the gains. And I do think it's important in raising that question, and I do think that like or just some sort of question about how prosperity is shared, but I do think could be really useful in could be useful in raising that question. I mean, not as a replacement for like shop floor organizing, but as like as something putting that on the table. But I think also is one of the things that is not. I mean, isn't necessary in all forms of UBI. That it's like, you know, sometimes more of a like, okay, well, like, you know, capitalists still own the robots and stuff, and like, you know, they'll pay their taxes and we redistribute it. But like, there's also a question of like, well, what, you know, what if we owned the robots? Like, you know, like, or like, who owns them? Who is like actually owns all these machines that are producing all this stuff in the kind of automation view? And so I think that is a valuable question to be asking around basic income. It's not like a necessary one, or it's not necessarily part of that discussion, but I think it's one that we should be putting out. And that is, you know, potentially one of the, you know, I think exciting things about it as a, you know, discussion. You know, I don't know very much about the case in Iran, so I mean, I would be very interested to hear whether you know, how that kind of worked out with like the subsidies, and whether, you know, the prices of commodities just like rose so much that it was kind of moot or whatever. And more about, you know, sort of, you know, the qualitative elements in general. And I mean, yeah, it's an interesting question, like, what would you ask people? There was this question that was, I think in advance of, like, there was a referendum in Switzerland that actually had a quite high level of basic provision, or of, like, the income level, in part because Switzerland has a very high, you know, cost of living, but they, you know, I mean, it wasn't really that much of a real, you know, referendum. I don't think they expected it to pass. It did not pass. And it was more kind of like a, you know, like PR campaign for basic income, but the question that they like painted on some like plaza or something, people may have seen this picture, but it's, what would you do? I can't remember the question. I shouldn't. But it's something like, what would you do if you didn't have to work or something? Or if you had free time, or what would you do if you had more free time or something like that? And I think, I mean, I would just be curious, like what people, you know, like what people do with their free time, like what they've found. I mean, it's pretty, it's not, like what, you know, people would want to spend their lives doing if they didn't have to go out and work for money. And I would be curious to hear what that was for people, so.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think
maybe on that question it would be good too, especially.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that, and it also relates to what the comrade over here was asking about, because, yeah, you want to just know, because people tend to ask these narrow questions. Oh, will people work less, or like, are they healthier? But like that broader question of just what people do with their time. So on a quantitative level, I would almost want something like the American Time Use Study, you know, like a time diary. And on a qualitative level, you need like an ethnography, basically, of like what people's lives are like. Which gets to this question about the effect of technical change in sort of in the industry. There is an interesting ethnography actually of dock workers in the 80s in Brooklyn, who essentially won themselves a little basic income because they were, you know, and this is the thing that had happened periodically, that people had come to this idea of something like a basic income. There's also people who came out of like the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit who were facing the effects of automation, who were led in this direction. But what happened to the dock workers in Brooklyn was containerization was coming in, and there was much less need for labor, but they had a strong union, and they essentially worked out a deal that said, okay, all our current members are going to keep getting paid whether or not there's work for them. And that was the deal that they struck in order to allow the bosses to continue this process of containerization. And then Bill DeFazio did an ethnography of them where he just spent time seeing, you know, did they become, you know, drunks, and did they just sort of ruin their lives? And no, he found them spending time with their families, getting more involved in the politics in their neighborhoods, all this kind of stuff. And so that's the kind of stuff in some ways that we need more of, that rich sort of texture of what, again, like Alyssa's question, what do people do if they don't have to work?
Was that a diminishing thing, or if they agreed that the jobs would be lost eventually?
Yeah, right. So I mean, obviously, you can't just strike this deal at the level of a single union local, because ultimately that only serves the members of that local. It's sort of, but that deal basically, like, we need a cut.
It's that deal at society level, and when the jobs go away, we still
right.
get paid.
We get it. You want to bring in the robots, we get a cut. That's the thing.
It's up to you.
I'm just curious what the results were of the study that you were involved in Kenya. What did they find?
It's about to start.
Oh, it's about to start.
It has been 15 years.
15 years?
Yeah.
Really? Wow.
And he said there was a very small amount. What is it relative to Kenyan income?
I don't know the amount that they get, but I do know they make less than $1 a day, and they have to live full time in a village, so it's a very different context.
Go ahead.
I was wondering the question that you were pointing out from formation, and there are Native American groups that have So I was wondering if there were any, and I use the term scientific or research done on that would be helpful. And then the other question is, how useful would that information be to looking at it? Because everything here has been discussed in a sort of European American capitalist consideration, and we get into the ethnographic aspects of it because a lot of these other cultures have a more communal underpinning than the individualistic, with the height of individualism, of course, being the United States, and shared to some degree, but to a lesser degree by European and other cultures, and the kind of European capitalism that's been spread to all the needs that everybody knows. That's been part of the underlying part of this individualism. So you're ending up with, you're looking for something that's collective, and as you said, has some very negative right-wing aspects of controlling labor and pushing income down, and other aspects of actually allowing people to participate more in the political process, and there's good tensions there. But I'd like some discussion on that.
Sorry, now.
Thank you. The title of your panel was Road to Utopia.
Oh, it wasn't. It was a left form error.
Then I'll use it because I was struck by it, because this seems like a...
And I think it was Road to Utopia. You know, it was a question mark.
That's my question, because it sounds pretty pessimistic. In the best case scenario, both of you guys have kind of articulated, it's a wedge issue that potentially could open up a bigger discussion. That in and of itself, universal basic income is really, to me at least, capitalism, if we had a strong left in this country, capitalist class with changing the tax policies, you could actually come up with some version of it, potentially. But it doesn't get you to utopia, let alone socialism. So I'm just curious if I misheard you guys in terms of your discussion, in terms of how you see it all.
And any more? So this is going to be the last one. Then after that, we could talk afterwards and so on. We're running short on time.
Well, it seems to me that, I mean, there's the right wing and there's the reformist kind of take on it. And the capitalist problem is with automation. A, your profit rate in the long term goes down. And B, your legitimacy goes down. Sorry. And that if you're going to have an industrial reserve army of labor, you need to keep them alive. Right? That's why capitalists like welfare to some degree, is because you need to keep unemployed workers alive. And it seems like UBI is a very streamlined way of doing that. The assumption is that those people who aren't working don't want to work. But it's not true. In that situation, when you got 10% of the population working, 90% are not working, sorry, 10% working, 90% not working, that 90% not working, they're going to be striving for jobs. That 10%, when they go on strike, are going to be extremely weak because they're going to have 90% of the population pounding on the door for those jobs, and there'll be division. The 10% who works will constantly want to stop paying for the UBI for the other 90%. And that's the division that capitalists take advantage of all the time. The alternative approach is the one you kind of refer to, but it's not. I don't think it's one you can just lump together. It's the alternative, and it was posed sharply in the 40s in the labor movement, which is shorter work hours for the same pay, which unites the working class because it says to the working person, you can work less if the unemployed get a job. And it says to the unemployed, you can get a job if they work less. That's like the opposite approach. And it's a transitional demand, not because it would change the structure of capitalism to something that would be more likely to become socialism, but because it helps educate people about why this is not a reasonable system, a just system, and the struggles that you would undertake to do that would help prepare you for the fight for power. The idea that you could somehow make a capitalism that would be more likely in and of itself to become socialism, I think is a fundamentally reformist idea.
So, building off that, I pose this to anyone who wants to answer, or you could just all, not answer it. But that example that Peter gave with the, I guess, ILA in the Northeast, is there a difference between people being happy in that situation because it's almost like a pension at this point? It's like the reward for like years of labor versus if someone's like, say, 23 years old, has just getting out of like, a long time in education, they know that there's socially necessary work out there. They just are not able to do it, or unable to kind of break into the labor market to do it in this future scenario. And would that maybe change how they respond to it, or?
I mean,
Sorry.
it certainly makes it different. I guess, for me, part of the value of basic income as a demand is establishing this idea of a social right that is not sort of stigmatized. Because you're right, it's like now a lot of things, even the cash transfers we have often are sort of justified, even though it's a fiction that like, oh, you only get Social Security because you worked for it, and then, like all this sort of thing. But I do think Seth sort of argued that there's this fundamental distinction between cash transfers and something like the National Health Service that everybody just treats as a social right. But my view is that there isn't necessarily. But since we've never had a large-scale mass UBI, it's like that's sort of an unanswerable question unless it actually happens.
Alyssa,
And I don't know if we wanted to address the other.
I have to say that I found your comment quite pertinent. We do always have to think about what the political and sort of collective dynamics are of any particular proposal or demand. What kind of effect does it have educationally in terms of shaping people's consciousness so that you can move on to whatever the next necessary struggle is? And I think that shorter hours have that kind of unifying effect. And also, to the extent that they're polarizing, they polarize in the right way. They polarize between, the people who own everything and the people who have to work. So I agree with that.
Yeah, I fully endorse, advocating for shorter hours. As Peter was saying, I think it's like, this is the thing where I think UBI has become this real, for people who are proponents, like a silver bullet solution, or it's come to be this sort of standalone proposal that, for many people who were like, oh, this will fix these other problems, like, the sort of on the utopian question, there's this book by this Dutch journalist, Rutger Bregman, called a Utopia for Realists. That's about UBI as like a, sort of like realistic utopia. But that's talking about like the sort of history of, like utopian thinking around like a land of like leisure and plenty and not having to work, and everyone like wants to not have to work, and that's like kind of this old, kind of utopian thing, but he's like, oh, it's realistic. But he also has this very like silver bullet will solve all the problems thing. And I don't think that's what any of us are saying, and I do, I kind of agree with Peter being like, we should probably stop having like UBI panels, because it's like not really, it's like it's like what is our vision of what the sort of post-capitalism we would like, and how do we get there politically. And I don't think that either that the idea is that like, UBI just like creates capitalism that's just like on the track to socialism or like, to undoing itself. I think it does, provide, its own, I think, educational or sort of like learning or sort of whatever, like presents questions about things like work or what would you want to do, and can create some sort of sense of like getting people to imagine what that is. And in fact, that's like often I think one of the limits where people are like, this sounds like too good to be true. Why would anyone do that? That's crazy. Like, and don't take it seriously. And that's been actually one of the political challenges. So maybe it hasn't really been that effective in that regard. But I guess also this is sort of going to some of like Bhaskar's earlier question about like, is it training people for, I guess, like either the struggle or like the post, like our socialist communist society. And I do think that there are things about like basic income, which also could be achieved through shorter hours, but that are about trying to, both that I think would be important for, I think any form of socialism, but especially like the like eco-feminist socialism that I would endorse, that would be about trying to, decenter the role of the work and sort of or like traditional work and our lives, and spend more time on the kinds of sort of like traditionally classed as like social reproduction or leisure activities that I think are important for like living a good life, and particularly doing so in a less materially intensive way. And so I think that there are important things about that. I don't think that basic income is the only or the necessary way to get to them. I think it presents like a useful utopian horizon, and maybe that's like all it is at this point. Like I don't feel in the short term, I don't feel very like hopeful about UBI going in a good direction, given the fact that like the right like controls power in the country right now. The people who are proponents of UBI are mostly like, I was saying, these like kind of techno-capitalists. So like I I don't think I would go out and be like, yes, let's go for UBI like in the near future, just given the sort of political dynamics. But I do think it's very like important to keep as a horizon, while also thinking about other ways, parts of a sort of like, you know, less work program, shorter hours being one of them, and you know, that while also sort of, as Peter's been saying, not just holding up like, well, a job is the only way that you can ever like have value in society or like have a livelihood. So
I think we can all agree that the goal of the working class is to abolish itself with the goal of, you know, socialism. The question is how we get there. But I think this is a very valuable contribution. We packed a lot into like an hour, 20 minutes. One final note: we have a Jacobin table out there in the exhibition area with $1 issues. If you want them, so please come by, say hello, and yeah, thank you all for coming.